Hello and welcome to the Hobby Hour. My name is Chase Untermeyer. I'm a professor of practice here at the Hobby School, and we are most honored today to have as our very special guest the Comptroller of the state of Texas, the Honorable Glenn Hegar. Glenn Hegar, a native of Katy, has been in state government for many years, having served in the Texas House and Texas Senate before being elected to the Comptroller's job in 2014. He was just reelected to a third term, and I note that he got over 3 million votes. He was, in fact, the top of the ticket of the other statewide executive positions, the governor, lieutenant governor, and others. So that shows that he's been doing something really good, and I think that will become evident in the course of our discussion. I should point out, especially since we have people in the audience who are students and aspiring to be in government, that we always talk a lot about public policy, and public policy is important. The ideas that motivate government and what we should do and how much we should do it. But I will tell you that public policy doesn't mean a thing until it has a dollar amount attached to it in a budget. And the creation of that budget is the main job of our state legislature when it convenes next month on January 10th. The namesake of this school, Bill Hobby, liked to say that the only thing the legislature has to do is pass a budget, and the rest of everything the legislature does is just poetry. That was his word. May be a little bit more prose than poetry, but in any event, his point was just the point I made, that follow the dollars, that is what really makes state government work. And we are with the man who knows where the dollars are and therefore has the best understanding of the mechanics of state government. So welcome to the program, Comptroller Hegar.
It's always good to be with you. Thanks for being on today.
Very good. To begin with, we'd like to get to know a bit more about you. And let's start with your family, which literally has its roots in the soil of Texas.
Yeah, that's right. My family originally moved to Texas in 1846. The first brother in my line got here in 1848, so 2 years later. So my family moved just to the northwest of the Houston area when they landed in Galveston, a little community called Hockley. So you drive Highway 290 northwest out of Houston. You go through Cypress, you pass the Grand Parkway, the most recent loop around Houston, and then you get to Hockley. If you blink, you miss it. However, suburbia is moving in that direction very rapidly. If you keep your eyes open, you'll see Hegar Road. It's spelled the exact same way. So my family farm is in that area. So I'm a sixth-generation Texan. I grew up on a family farm out there when it was very rural Texas, and now it's not so rural anymore. And so after going to school here locally, public education, a community called Waller is where I went to school at, went off to college, actually moved back, came to work with the family. We were very much in agriculture, whether it's our family farm, a grain elevator, equipment dealerships at the time. And so I decided to move back, work with the family. My wife, we met in law school. She's from Katy, which is where we still call home, even though I'm in Austin every single week. I'm heading to Austin here in just a few minutes. I'm in my Katy office right now, and then I'm heading to Austin this afternoon. We'll be there for the next several days. So I'm in Austin quite a bit, travel quite a bit, but we still call northwest area our home, which is both her roots and my roots.
And what kind of crops has your family raised over time and still do?
So over time, there's been a wide variety of things over the time. But when I was growing up out there, it was actually a rice farm. And so my family started farming rice in the area around World War II, towards the end of World War II, and continued up till about 20 years ago. And so bulk of my time grew up out in the rice paddies, as they would say, where there's water and with a shovel in my hand, a lot of manual hard work, driving equipment. I've made the comment that even though I'm the 36th Comptroller of Public Accounts, every person that has served in this capacity over the years have obviously had some form of profession. I'm a lawyer by education. I was a political science and history major when I was in college, got a Master of Arts in international economics. So those are the areas that I studied. But in fact, I joke with my staff sometime that I'm actually the first truck driver to ever serve as the Comptroller of Public Accounts. And you go, well, wait, I didn't know that. Actually, I drove an 18-wheeler a lot when I was a kid and in college, hauling our crops from our family farm to the grain elevator there in Waller. So I've done a wide variety of roles in the last 20 years, historically, we have been farming corn, hay. The family's had cattle. So those have been our principal crops during the time that I've been growing up as a child on the farm, and then more recent in the last couple of decades.
Oh, terrific. At what point along the way did the political bug bite?
That's an interesting question. And people always kind of ask, how did you get involved in politics? And I will say from a very young age, my family, they voted, but they were not politically involved. They didn't work on campaigns. They weren't doing, in fact, I grew up on a farm. They worked all the time, to be very blunt and honest. It was very, very intensive, a lot of work throughout the year, all year round. However, they were politically mindful, knew that obviously serving in government is an important role, being involved, voting. And so ever since a young age, I had some attraction to government. Who are these people? What the decisions that they make impact our lives and actually have very long lasting implications potentially to our lives of the policies that they ultimately make a decision on. And so very early on, that was something that I felt I wanted to serve in some capacity. I didn't know what, I didn't know where, didn't know if that opportunity would ever come about. My wife and I started dating in college, and I had made the comment to her. I said, and as it got more serious, and I could tell this was a relationship that seemed to be going somewhere. And I just said, in all full disclosure, Glenn Hegar may want to run for office someday. And she joked years later when she kind of roasted me at an event and said, I thought it was just a whim, really. And then here we are. I served in the Texas House, as you made a comment in the introduction, for 4 years. I served in our state Senate for 8 years. And then now I've been the controller for 8 years and moving into my third term. So therefore, I have just hit the end of this month, we'll finish 20 years in state government in some capacity and 4 more yet to go, which is kind of hard to imagine. I never envisioned I would be essentially serving the bulk of my adult working years in government in some capacity, whether it's in the executive branch or in the legislative branch.
And did that all begin in high school or college? Were you active in campus politics?
Yeah, I was in high school. I was involved in campus politics, student government. In college, believe it or not, I did not. I was one of those students, to be honest, many years ago. My wife, as my kids, I have a 17-year-old daughter, a senior in high school. I have a daughter and a son, my twins that are 14 in 8th grade. And so one of the jokes of my wife when the kids are talking about what books they are reading for, say, literature, English, some novel they may be reading. And my wife always kind of jokes, said, well, why don't you ask your dad about that? That was probably one of his favorites. Well, that's a jab at Glenn Hegar because my wife knows I never read in high school. I never did. I never opened a book till college. And so, it kind of popped up about right before my senior year. And I went, oh my gosh, I'm expected to go to college. Nobody in my family had gone to college before. I was the first one. And so therefore, all of a sudden in college, I stepped up my game, let's just say. And I would go back and forth, work with the family. I always worked in the summers. I worked over spring break. I worked over Christmases. So I really didn't feel like I had time to be engaged in campus politics at that time. But then in law school, I was again. And subsequently, after I got out of law school, we moved home. My wife and I moved back to this area, set up our family, our jobs. And I started getting involved in the local politics in my own community. And ultimately, that's what's led to me running for the legislature back in 2002.
Was it an open seat, or did you have to run against an incumbent?
It was. So the county that I grew up in, our family farm, the bulk of it is in Harris County, but a portion of it is in Waller County. And I actually grew up as a resident of Waller County. So half of us are in one county, half of us are in another. And Waller County, because of redistricting every 10 years, as we know, the new census every 10 years, and then the legislative boundaries of the 150 in the Texas House, the 31 in the state Senate, as well as some other statewide offices. And then obviously U.S. Congress get reapportioned. And so my county at the time, Waller County, was going to be redistricted into a new district. And so I was paying attention to that. I was very, astute, as in knew it would be combined probably with Fort Bend County, which is where we call home, and a third county. And so I was watching that process, being involved. And so therefore it was a brand new legislative seat. There was no incumbent that lived in that district at the time. So there were 5 of us that ran in the Republican primary. There was nobody that ran as a Democrat, so it was all in the Republican primary. In fact, on election night, the interesting part is of the 5 of us, I won my home county very wide. It was a very large margin. Fort Bend County, even though that's where we call home, I wasn't doing as well because every other candidate was from that county. And in fact, we waited until about 2 o'clock in the morning for the last precinct to come in Fort Bend County. The thought was if it was a very large precinct, Glenn wasn't doing as well in that county because with the 4 other candidates were from there, there was a pretty good chance I wouldn't be in the runoff. If it was a smaller precinct, the numbers would be in my favor, and I actually had enough votes to come in first or second. So I came in first with 29% of the vote. The next guy had 28. The next guy had 27. And so there were 3 of us that were neck and neck. And literally it wasn't until 2:30 in the morning when the last box came in that I knew that I was actually in the runoff. So, just literally it goes to show that every vote counts, every single effort, every day, every door that you knock on, every hand that I shook, every person that I talked to literally made a difference in that election. Because if I did anything less, there's a high probability I would have either come in second or third, and Glenn Hegar wouldn't be talking to you as the controller today, nor would I served in the state Senate.
And how about the state Senate? Was that also an open seat, or did that have special story?
It was. So my state senator decided not to run for re-election. And so therefore he decided really right before Christmas that he officially was not going to run for re-election. I had not filed for re-election because I was kind of waiting to see what he would do. In part, I did not plan to run for the Senate, but we had a conversation for about an hour. And I was just asking, his thoughts, his opinion. Should I stay in the House? Should I try to run to the Senate? It's just a different process. People ask me, what are the differences between the 2 chambers? And typically my answer is, can I tell you the similarities of being a member in the Texas House and in the state Senate? And I go, of course. Differences, similarities, it's probably the same answer. In fact, the only similarity between being a member in the House and a member in the Senate is they both get paid $600 a month. Other than that, the processes are different. The way you operate are substantially different. Yes, it's both legislative, but it's just very different processes. And so therefore, in that hour-long conversation, I finished. My wife said, well, what did Senator Armbruster say? And I said, well, in all the conversation, he said, Glenn, you're in your early 30s, correct? Yes, sir. He said, I was too when I ran. I had dark hair, no gray hair at the time as well. I do now. And in fact, I've been in the state Senate for 20 years. So the question you have to ask yourself, Glenn, do you run now or do you wait 20 years until the office may come back open again? And my wife looked at me and she said, it sounds like you're probably running for the Senate now. And so we made a very quick move. The interesting part, and I make this point to candidates, is there's 2 different elections. One, there's the election before the filing period is closed. And then there's the election during the process until election day. And when I say that, because there's 2, because I would say, in fact, in that very short window before the filing period closed at the end of December of that year in 2005, and then when the election was in March of 06 back then, is that I talked on the phone almost every day. And I probably can easily say that I talked somewhere between 6 and 7 people out of running for the state Senate. So I narrowed the pool down to where there were just 3 of us in that primary, and therefore I was able to win without a runoff. Otherwise, if there was more people, there would have been an extended runoff, just like there was when I ran for the House of Representatives originally.
And in the legislature, both House and Senate, what did you specialize in? Was it fiscal matters leading to state budgetary issues?
Yeah, what's interesting is you pretty much you get to ask for what committees that you want to serve on, but it's up to, as say, for example, the Speaker of the House or the Lieutenant Governor. You serve at the pleasure of what committees they put you on until you build up enough seniority, and you can actually then have a little more say in what committees you're on. So when I was a first member of the House of Representatives, I actually served, and I continue to work on these issues in criminal justice. I didn't come from a criminal justice background, but that's an area that I got put in a committee. I enjoyed those issues a lot. It was very eye-opening, important work, obviously, for law enforcement, our daily lives as citizens. And very quickly, I moved into the budgeting process. And so I've always been on fiscal matters, both in the House of Representatives and the Senate, which I think both of those help prepare me in part for part of this job. Just to kind of make a point, I know we'll get more into this here in a second, but my agency, if we're fully staffed, 3,000 people. I have over 20 divisions. We have a whole host of wide range of issues that we handle more than just running the Treasury and the collections of the state revenues. And so therefore, we have our hands in a lot of different pieces of state government. The legislature gave me 4 new jobs last legislative session alone that are not in our traditional constitutional wheelhouse per se. And so therefore, this agency is one where if they like the controller, if they like the job that you're doing, you tend to have new responsibilities that come your way. And so there's a lot of opportunities to engage with the public, to engage with the legislature. And so I was involved in fiscal matters, but I think that wider breadth of issues that I worked on, whether it was road infrastructure, water infrastructure, educational issues, tort reform issues, private property rights. So there was a wide range of issues. And when you serve, especially in the Senate, more so than in the House. In the House, you almost specialize in a couple of areas because you're very focused on a couple of committees. And in the Senate, since there's only 31 members, you literally can deal with one issue 1 minute and you're flipping to something else the next minute. And so you're very much more dependent on your staff than when you are in the House. You don't have as big a staff. And so you tend to specialize more in the House of Representatives potentially. And then in the Senate, you're much more general because you cover so many different issues that you're involved in. And that was one thing that I love about serving in the legislature was the public policy perspective. I'm not a policymaker now. Obviously, I help provide some of the guardrails of some of the information and data that they have to make decisions on. But the decision is ultimately the legislative branch. And I always try to keep in mind there are 3 separate branches of government. There's a reason there's 3 separate branches of government, and each one has a different responsibility and a duty. And so therefore, how do we provide those that are the policymakers correct information and data, but then that is their job to make those decisions. And ultimately, my job is to implement or to help supplement the data that they need.
Well, this is a perfect time to start talking about the office of Comptroller of the state of Texas, and at least the biggest items that you have to wrestle with. First of all, let me ask a question that's probably asked you more than any other, and that is how to pronounce the name, because there is a P in the middle of state Comptroller. Is it pronounced?
I'll answer it this way. Whenever one of my deputies in executive with me, he went over to the legislature in the first few days of the legislative session when I just got sworn into office, and somebody had asked him this question, said, Mr. Wood, is it controller or comptroller? I need, we really want to know the answer to that question. And he said, well, let me explain it this way. As of the end of December, I was working for Comptroller Susan Combs. And he says, in January, I began working for Comptroller Glenn Hegar. It's, in other words, however the boss pronounces it. When I ran for office, actually 8 years ago, and did all my TV media and all of that, I was very specific when I would say, I am Glenn Hegar and I am running for Texas Comptroller. I would say it and enunciate that, in part because the word is up there on the TV screen, COMP. And as you might have mentioned in the beginning, I'm an Aggie. And so therefore I figured if anybody saw that Aggie ring and I'd say controller, and they'd go, oh my gosh, the guy can't even pronounce the word that he's running for, and we're going to vote for this guy. And so actually the correct pronunciation is controller, and that's the way I say it. But it is interesting in the agency because it's kind of dependent on who's been in the role over the time. About half of the employees say controller and half say comptroller. It's kind of whatever they learned when they first started in whoever they started working for over the course of the last several years as different administrations have come and gone.
Good. Well, I'm glad we've covered that completely.
Glad we got that out of the way, Chase. That was important for the hobby hour.
Absolutely. To my eye, and I've been watching state government since the 70s, the job of controller was pretty sleepy, almost unknown. And then a gentleman named Bob Bullock got elected to controller in 1974, and he revolutionized the office. So what is the office, and what did Bullock discover in it that his predecessors never did?
Yeah, that's a great question, and you're right. I mean, you've watched politics for a long time, and it was a very sleepy office. And Bob Bullock, who has a library, the Texas History Library named after him, and was lieutenant governor for many years, served in this role for 16 years actually as controller. He really kind of revolutionized this agency. He updated it in technology capabilities. So from a constitutional perspective, I have three main responsibilities. One, we run the state treasury. So $126 billion that runs through the state treasury. That means 14 million payments are issued on behalf of the state of Texas for the citizens for all expenses that run through the treasury. Just to make a point, if I sit at my desk and the only thing I did was sign payments, checks, which obviously it's electronic transfers are the bulk of the payments we make these days. It's not physical checks that you sign your name to. I would have to sit at my desk if nothing I did other than sign checks 40 hours a week. And I did that 52 weeks out of the year. I didn't take off for lunch, didn't take off for Good Friday, for Christmas, for Thanksgiving, no holidays whatsoever. I would have to sign about 112 checks every 60 seconds to issue every payment out of the treasury. So that just kind of puts in size the scope of the state treasury. So it's a very large operation. We make sure all the accounting is in place. All of our financials are in place for the state, the transparency of state government. So that's one responsibility. The second responsibility is the tax collection. So the bulk of all the tax collection falls in this agency. In most states, that's two separate agencies. One handles the treasury, one handles the tax collection. Here in Texas, we like to do things different. Everything is combined into one agency. And then the last constitutional responsibility is the day before a legislative session. It is my job and solely my job. In every other state, there is a committee of either legislators and or executive members, some combination, that makes a decision on this is what we think will come in the treasury in the next year, in the next 2 years, whatever that state budget. Texas, we do a 2-year state budget. Most states, the vast majority, do a 1-year state budget, and that committee will make a decision on those economic assumptions of how much money will come in the treasury. Here in Texas, that solely is my responsibility, which in part brings some of the influence of the agency with the legislative process. Because as you mentioned in the introduction, as Lieutenant Governor Hobby said, that is the one and only thing the legislature has to do is pass a state budget. So you're very involved in that process. However, it also means there's nobody else to blame other than Glenn Hegar when the economy, and bear in mind this, when I got in this role 8 years ago, the state economy, Texas as a state, if it was a nation, was the 12th largest economy in the entire world. Fast forward 8 years, we've moved to the 11th, to the 10th. And now, as we sit here, we are the 9th largest economy in the entire world. And in fact, come in the next few years, we'll move up to become the 8th largest economy. So it's a very complex economy. It's very diverse, very large, very vast. So I spend a lot of my time on that issue. And I spend a lot of my time managing expectations of the direction of the economy, even though I only provide an official revenue forecast before legislative session. And then it's at my discretion to provide them updates during the year. So when something substantially changes in the economy. So those are the three main responsibilities, but there's a whole host of other jobs and duties that we have as well.
So when do you actually make the forecast? Is that on the convening of the legislature?
Yeah, so me and my team, we're always working on our economic assumptions and data. We talk constantly. The team that works on this issue, that's their sole job. I interface with them a substantial amount. That's one area that I'm very involved in. And just to be very blunt, honest, I've seen two of my predecessors that is the issue that, for lack of better phrases, kind of cut their knees out from under them. The fact is, when I first came in the role as a legislator, the economy was contracting. The controller said it was going to be a budget deficit, maybe, and then said, oh, yes, there is one. And then, oh, by the way, there's a bigger deficit. And I think part of that was messaging. I thought part of that was managing the message of where the economy was going. And then one of my most immediate predecessor, it was the opposite. We had one of the hardest budget sessions we've ever had when I was in the state Senate in 2011. We cut the budget. We cut actually public education funding. We didn't fund enrollment growth. And at the time, we were growing about 80 to 90,000 new students in the public education system a year. And we didn't fund those additional students. We didn't have the money. And then, in fact, after we closed up session, between then and the next session in 2013, the state economy actually just soared and took off. And so we came back, we were able to restore those cuts. But the point is, people essentially blamed both of them of not really telling us where the economy was going. And so that's probably one of the things that keeps me up at night. And so I focus on it a lot. We start working on that process in October. I actually have my revenue estimate number. I know what I'm going to provide to the legislature. I have all the underlying data to that we'll lay this out on the second Monday in January. So the legislature comes in on the second Tuesday in January. That's when they're constitutionally start legislative session. And so this year it'll be on the 9th of January. I will provide that official estimate to the legislature, and we'll continue to work with them through session. If something substantially changes in the economy up or down, we may adjust that number. But again, here's one thing to keep in mind for anybody that's listening. When I provide that estimate to the legislature in January of 2023, that state budget doesn't start until September 1 of 2023. And then it actually runs for 2 years after that. And so therefore it is a very long window into the future, and you're not going to get all the data right. You're going to get some of this wrong. I mean, there's just no way. It's a global economy and very entwined. The Texas economy is tied to it. And so that's one reason I stay focused on it and continue to manage that expectation as the economy is changing. I'm talking to policymakers, the legislature, and the public that the numbers that we set in January, actually they've changed. And here's why they've changed. And I think as long as you do that, then people know that you're not trying to play games with the numbers. You're just being very transparent in the data that you see and as you're receiving those receipts coming in the Treasury.
Imagine the impulse is to be very conservative in the estimate.
That is correct. That is correct. It's much better. And I'll use this for example, those that, live on the Gulf Coast, those that maybe now going to U of H and maybe live somewhere else. And now at the Gulf Coast, it doesn't take you long to get used to paying attention to hurricanes. And so when hurricanes enter the Gulf Coast, that certainty is that it'll hit somewhere between Brownsville at the very tip of Texas, maybe somewhere over to Mississippi. And then as the hurricane moves further in, it refines. And so the point being is that refining gets narrower over time, and you get a better glimpse of what's coming over time. And so therefore, economic modeling is you take assumptions and you can go in several different directions depending on just a couple of assumptions and a small tweak. And so therefore, of those different models that you kind of run, you're better off to go with the more conservative numbers, because it's a lot easier after the end of a 2-year budget cycle to say, oh, actually the economy's done better. We have more money in the Treasury, and you're talking about it through that whole process so the legislature knows and they're well informed. Then coming up at the end of a budgeting process, oops, I'm sorry, we were over optimistic and actually we have less money than we thought. It's easier to have money in the bank as savings than it is to be in a deficit. So you're always going to be more conservative in your economic modeling than optimistic.
Some of us, when I was serving in the legislature, suspected that in that desk of yours in Austin, that there's a bottom drawer, and in it is a lot of extra cash that toward the end of a legislative session, the comptroller suddenly discovers this drawer and opens it up and finds out that, well, maybe we can spend a little bit more.
Well, I think there's usually I try to be on the lookout for if there's opportunities to be creative and or have, say, for example, one of the things that I always talk about this in speeches is if you go online and look at claimittexas.org, and again, claimittexas.org, what does that have to do with anything? That's called unclaimed property. So businesses, if you live somewhere, you put a utility deposit down. If you're a student and you moved and you forgot to get your utility deposit back, the company looks for you. And if they can't find you, then after a certain number of years, they turn it over to typically the state treasury here, the comptroller's office. And so that's called unclaimed property. And we return roughly about $300 million a year back to people in unclaimed property. You go, well, where's Glenn going with this? Well, sometimes those things are stocks. There's bonds that people have. They have with different investment outfits. Believe it or not, they don't claim it. How do they lose it? I'm not sure, but they do. We will manage those in the treasury. And then when the market's a high, we will sell those. And you go, well, wait, what does that have to do with the budgeting process? When there's times of lean, if the market's at a high, and I've done this before, where we sell those assets and we keep them, they're your money. It's always your money, but it's easier for us to manage cash than it is investments. And so therefore we'll sell it. That moves in the treasury, and the legislature can actually spend that money but we always owe it to you. And so therefore, several years ago, when the legislature was having a tough budgeting cycle, at the end of session, they go, Glenn, we really need some more money. And I go, I've got a way to get you a few $100 million. And so therefore, yes, every once in a while, it's good to be the treasurer. It's good to be the controller, and you can find a little bit of money, and you might actually have a request or two for your own state agency. And one of the things that I have tried to do over the times is make sure we keep up with our IT systems, our computer systems. We keep updated with technology. And when you asked earlier, how did Bob Bullock transcend this office from a sleepy office into one that was much more influential? He updated it in technology, in systems. And back then, that was a long time ago. And so it wasn't computers, it wasn't phones, it wasn't the type of apps that we have today. It was, upgrading from typewriters to eventually computers, slide rules to calculators. So that was technological change back then. But he understood that updating the office into modern technology brought efficiencies, it brought greater transparencies, and it also, unfortunately, it takes money to do that thing. And so, yes, the controller may come in and say, hey, you need a little money. I've got an idea too.
Well, it's a ways before the second Monday in January, but there have already been some figures out there being thrown around as to what is available for the legislature to spend. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I can. So let me just, not to bore you all with a bunch of numbers, but I'm gonna give one number, one number here to put in perspective of where we've been in the revenues of the state treasury in the last year and actually the last year and a half. The state economy has done extremely well. Unfortunately, part of those revenues is because of inflation. People are paying more for items this year than they were last year. And if things cost more, guess what? They pay more in taxes. And so therefore, some of my revenues are inflation driven because we are paying more. But a big portion of it is the economy has just really outperformed expectations here in the state. And we've continued to talk about that as we've seen it move forward. So here's a point. In the last 30 years, there have been 3 times in Texas history where our total tax collections in one year compared to the prior year was a double-digit increase. Those 3 times have been 10 to 13% increase in one year's tax collections compared to the prior year. So very healthy increase. When I closed the books at the end of August of this year in 2023, September 1 is the start of our new budget cycle. In fact, last year's tax receipts were over 25% increase compared to the year before. So that is a once in a lifetime substantial increase in revenues. That also means it's a once in a lifetime that the legislature will have a large cash carryover balance at the end of this 2-year budget cycle to the next one. And in fact, usually when I give the estimate, we're talking about a couple $2 billion maybe that we have cash carryover balance from one year to the next. In fact, when I give the revenue estimate, I'm not giving an official exact number, but the legislature will have a cash carryover balance in excess of $30 billion. Yesterday on social media, I made the point because I saw that the nation Saudi Arabia had made an announcement last week that they have a cash carryover balance of $27 billion. I sent that article to my team and I said, well, you can add that to our list of social media for next year. That in fact, congratulations. But Texas, actually, we're going to have a larger surplus than Saudi Arabia. It'll be in excess of $30 billion. So it's a substantial once in a lifetime opportunity for the legislature to either provide infrastructure funding in one type of lifetime opportunities or property tax cuts, a variety of different issues the legislature is going to look at as in. But then lastly, also understand they are constrained in Texas. We are constrained by the number that Glenn Hegar gives them, as in the total revenues coming in. They can't spend any more. We have to have a balanced budget in Texas. We're not like DC where we can do deficit spending. And then secondly, they have what's called a constitutional spending limit. So the current budget plus population inflation and a certain amount of income growth limits the amount of money that they can spend in the second budget. And so therefore, there's a very high probability that they can't spend all that $30 billion in excess in addition to the revenues coming in because they are limited by these constitutional spending limits.
So you will peg that number, let's say 30 billion, but it'll be a lower number than that the legislature actually has in terms of extra income to apply.
That's right. That's really not only the revenues that they have in the next 2-year budget, but there'll be 30 billion on top of that, because that's a cash carryover balance from this 2-year budget cycle to the next one. So typically what the budget increase in revenues over time, because we're growing 1,000 people a day here in Texas, we have an additional 1,000 people that call Texas home every day, either natural growth or people moving here. We have businesses that are moving here. So we're growing as an economy, and that means our revenues, maybe not every single year, but over time, we're outpacing the national average in growth. We're growing. So the new 2-year budget growth will occur because we're growing as an economy. And then it's 30 on top of that. And that doesn't include our state savings account, or what's called our rainy day fund, which that fund is our state savings account. It's a little nest egg off to the side. The legislature has to take a supermajority vote in the House and the Senate to pull money out of it, because it is our state savings account. And it has about $14 billion in it. But the irony is, Chase, that I am showing up in January to tell the legislature that exact figure, that $30+ billion cash carryover balance, all the details of the revenues. But I'm also, unfortunately, probably going to tell them that sometime in the next year, probably the latter part of next year, we do think the economy in Texas will outperform the national average, the global economy. But there are headwinds in the global economy. There's headwinds in the national economy, and undoubtedly Texas will have a mild recession in the upcoming year.
Okay, well, that gives us a chance to talk to you in a couple of years to see where those numbers all fell. There's a very powerful outfit called the Legislative Budget Board that you're a member of. Can you tell us about that and what its power is?
Yeah, so there's what's called the Legislative Budget Board, and that is the lieutenant governor, the speaker. They appoint 5 members of the House and the Senate, and essentially they're kind of the governing body during the they set how much growth they think will occur. We provide them some economic numbers. Some other economists provide them some numbers. What do we think population will increase in Texas? What is income growth in Texas? What is inflation? And then they'll use those to make an estimate of how much the budget could potentially grow from this current 2-year budget to the next. So they make those decisions. They also are kind of just they have a staff that works for them, about 100 different staffers that helps them write the budget, because that budget is extremely thick, legal size, small, fine print. So it's a very, very dense document of all 100+ state agencies. So they need a lot of staff to help them work through the mechanics of all the different requests, the minutia. So it's very detail driven. So that staff helps them with that. But the Legislative Budget Board, the lieutenant governor, the speaker, and then those 5 members in the House and the Senate, one of the things, Texas has tools in the toolbox that, even though we're not in session, but every 2 years, we set a 2-year budget. If the economy changes, between them and the governor can actually have what's called budget execution authority. And what that means is they can move money from one area to another area. If we have extra needs in one area, say, for example, the border this year, just to make a point, we have a tremendous amount of need on the border. There's lots of people coming in the state, people that are having to get processed, trying to deal with where do these people go. And so there's been a lot of resources the state has had to put on the border, and that amount wasn't envisioned when the legislature was there. So they've moved money, but when the legislature comes back in January, they can backfill those areas that they used money from. So between sessions, the Legislative Budget Board, and working with the governor, has that authority to move things around. So it keeps the trains running on time. It keeps state government functioning without the legislature having to come back into session and redo the budget. They can, within certain limitations, move a little bit of money around, keep everything operating efficiently and effectively. And then when they come back into session, they can readjust and make any different decisions that they need to backfill dollars in some areas that they had to take money from to overcompensate expenses they didn't account.
And it's a good point to make that when people are surprised that the Texas legislature meets only 20 weeks every 2 years, and they ask, how can such a large state with such a big economy do that? The answer is you do.
We do.
It's a combination of conservative estimation and strict budgeting, and then the flexibility you just described.
That's right. And one of the things many years ago, there were some of the credit rating agencies didn't want to give Texas the credit for all the tools in the toolbox that we have. Oh, how can you govern every 2 years when you need to be in session every single year? And in fact, we have a lot of ways to manage that. And as you mentioned, conservative budgeting is one. The second one is a few of these tools, they don't use them very often, but when they need to, they can. And so we can keep Texas operating very efficiently as relative to many other states here in the nation.
Well, we've been talking about the spending side. Let's talk about the revenue side. Roughly speaking, where does the state of Texas get its money?
Yeah, so if you look at our state budget, 1/3 of it is federal money. Our state budget about $126 billion. Unbelievable amount of money. 1/3 of that is federal money. You and I pay federal taxes. Those taxes come back to the states, whether it's road infrastructure, education. Very little federal money into public education. That's principally local taxes and state taxes. But whether some of those flow into higher education or whether it's health and human services, which is healthcare programs. So a wide variety of different programs that those monies are put into. So about 1/3 of the state budget is federal money. The remaining 2/3 is state revenues. The biggest piece of the state revenues is obviously tax collections. There's some investments or some other pieces of revenues that come in, but tax collections is the biggest piece. Of tax collections, Texas, 60% roughly of all the tax collections are sales tax. So you and I go purchase items, businesses purchase items, those sales tax, that's the bulk of the revenue source for the state. And then automobile sales tax is actually another 6 to 9% on top of that. Depends on, car prices have been much higher in the last year and a half, 2 years. Used car prices were very elevated. The lack of supply, the demand was high. So it's been closer to 9%, where historically it's about 6%. So the point being is 65 to 70% of all the revenues is in the sales tax world. And then you have severance tax, which is oil and gas that comes out of the ground. There's a tax that's paid per cubic meter that comes out or barrel of oil. Also, there's a business tax that's called the franchise tax. There's the sin taxes. And you go, well, what do you mean sin taxes? Alcohol, tobacco, and there's a wide variety of other smaller, but the bulk of it is the sales tax area, the margins or the business taxes it's called, and severance tax. Those are the three big pieces for the state budget overall. And those are typically going to be roughly about 80 to 85% of all the tax collections we have are in those three areas.
And what percentage is the extraction tax of oil and gas?
So it kind of ebbs and flows depending on the price, but the price and the volume that comes out of the ground. And so right now, my guess is, I haven't looked at this month exact percent, but my guess is it's a little bit less than 10%. Usually it's somewhere between 7 to 9%. And it's up on the higher end right now because even though prices of what's called WTI, West Texas Intermediary, has gone down than where they were a couple months ago, there's still the same volume coming out, and natural gas prices are higher than they've been in the last several years. So we're actually deriving more from natural gas than actually we have in the last decade, because the price of natural gas, the global constraint is it's higher. The volume that is out there because of the war in Ukraine, Russian invasion, the price of natural gas is higher. So therefore we're bringing in more receipts because of that higher price.
Now, when the ordinary Texan looks and considers taxes, my guess is that he or she is mostly thinking about sales taxes, but also property taxes. Mm-hmm. Now, the state doesn't have a property tax, but what impact on local property taxation does the state have?
Yeah, so the state has a constitutional ban on property taxes. So I don't collect any property taxes. That is fundamental of local governments, whether that's cities, counties, and or school districts. So if you live in a city, roughly 50% of your property tax bill is ISD. The point is, because that's a higher percent than the other governmental entities. If you live in a rural area, you don't live in a town, roughly about 2/3 of your property tax bills are ISD. So that's where a higher percentage of it of the property tax portion is at, just because there's a larger portion that you're paying there than you are to other local governmental entities. So the state of Texas does have a role in that, because there's a little over 1,000 school districts in the state of Texas. That funding stream for school districts in the state of Texas are two principal sources. One, you and I pay property taxes, and they get that on the local side. And then the state funding formulas that we fund, as in state taxpayers, we fund school districts for their daily average attendance within that school. So it's calculated on a formula. There's some adjustments that take into those areas that have very high transportation costs compared to a suburban urban area where kids might ride their bikes or they walk to school. They in a rural area, they're going to have large transportation systems to go pick kids up in the bus system. So there are adjustments, is my point. But the main piece is there's a funding formula for kids attending every day in school. And that's one reason daily attendance is always taken, because they don't get paid when those kids are not in the school and the kids are not getting educated. So that education system is a combination. The state of Texas wants to make sure that valuations across the state for property taxes are equally valued from one county to the next. And so therefore there is some process because of that school funding system to make sure that everybody's appraised equally across the state. You don't have one that is appraised very low, one and that is appraised very high. So that becomes an attention issue of those appraisal values. But what's equally important is, what is your local tax rate? Tax rate is extremely important. And so the state of Texas doesn't collect property taxes, but the property tax system for public education is important because that also determines what percent is paid locally, what percent is paid by us as state taxpayers.
Now, you're not in the policy business, but one option the legislature has with regard to all that extra money that you mentioned is to give a greater percentage of state support of public education, which would require a less of a burden for local independent school districts, which means they could lower property taxes. So that is an idea that is out there. You could say the same is true also with regard to medical costs, particularly in urban counties. We have not expanded Medicaid in Texas in accordance with possibilities of the so-called Obamacare or Affordable Care Act. That's another policy thing the legislature could do that would mean that local governments would not have to have property taxation to pay for those things. So there is a connection.
There is a connection, and it's extremely important to understand that connection of how do we ensure affordability of care, that uncompensated, as people cannot afford that care, yet they come into the emergency service room or somewhere in the hospital system. It has to be made up by somebody. And so therefore others end up paying that bill in some part because that indigent care is a cost and it has to be there, and people need to have that health care. And so therefore all of these policy choices have real implications over time. And so that's one reason I think from a legislative standpoint, yes, I'm not the policymaker, but at least I try to provide some parameters of from my opinion, what we need to do, not just in the current 2-year budget, but for the longer pace of the health of the state of Texas, for us that live here, economic opportunities. And so with the dollars they have unprecedented that will never occur ever again in our lifetime, in my opinion, are a couple things. One, how do you provide substantial property tax relief? Because I think that is the tax where we need to have more relief than somewhere else. And then secondly, how do we utilize those dollars for once in a lifetime investments in long-term dividends that will impact the state of Texas? One of the points that I make, the legislature gave me a new task last legislative session, one of many new tasks. And one of those new tasks is hard to imagine. In the state of Texas, there are 7 million people that do not have high-speed broadband connectivity in their homes. And so to put that in perspective, we have almost 30 million people, about 23% of the entire state of Texas doesn't have it, even if they could afford it and want to purchase it. It does not exist. And so therefore, to be able to improve economic life, to be able to improve options for education, this right here, we have to have that internet capability for higher education, public education, for telemedicine. And so therefore my office is working to identify where those areas are across the state, to use the dollars that are coming back to the state of Texas and some of the infrastructure bills that Congress passed bipartisanly, to how do we invest those dollars for infrastructure across the state to connect the state, which will give better economic opportunities. So I think that this legislative session gives us an opportunity to put a bigger investment in that infrastructure that is needed for the state for economic opportunities that people can have all across the state of Texas. So that's just one example, is my point of that's a policy that's something that's costing us today, not as a state or an individual that you can easily say, but is that an opportunity that's an economic opportunity in the future? But we don't have that either telemedicine or education wise. When I was doing a tour on broadband across the state in the spring, for example, I was in Abilene, Texas, at the community college, and the young lady was not there, but they talked about one young lady who is attending community college, and during the pandemic, to get internet service, she literally climbed up the windmill on their family farm with her computer to climb up to the top so she could log in to upload and download her work. We don't need kids climbing windmills in rural Texas to get internet service. And so therefore that student needs to be able to access and have that economic opportunity to gain an education, just like everybody else is there at the hobby school.
Is there money to expand broadband in Texas?
There is. It's very costly to be able to do fiber, which means that it actually a line laid in the ground from home to home, business to business across the state. Now that is the wisest investment over time, and I use it like a road. You know, a road infrastructure that we build. Maybe everybody wants to have a concrete road, but you can't afford to build one. We need to build an asphalt road, or if we can't, we build a gravel road. It'd be better to have a gravel road than no road. And my point being is, I think there's two ways. One, we have to plan to build that infrastructure for fiber across the state of Texas over time. But in the intermediate, we need bridges, and those bridges would use other types of technology, whether it's wireless, it's satellite, dish. We need to be able to use these other modes of technology to be able to get us there, which are more cost efficient in the immediate time. It's very costly over time, so we can't do it all overnight. We can't do it all in one day, but I think we can have a phase to get us there over time.
You mentioned that the legislature giveth and the legislature taketh away when it comes to the duties of the Comptroller's office. If I'm not mistaken, at one point, one of your very celebrated predecessors, John Sharp, had the ability to do management audits of state government, even local governments. I believe that was taken away. Or do you still have the ability to assess how well units of government are doing their jobs?
Yeah, that was one that under Sharp, John Sharp, when he was controller, these audits were provided as an opportunity to get efficiencies in state government. It was seen as a cost savings for the state. So it was a way that the legislature actually had a tough budgeting cycle. They needed to be able to cut money. They needed to be able to save money. They needed to try to find more revenue sources to pay the bills because it was a downturn in the economy substantially. And this was one way to gain efficiencies. And so therefore the agency did that. They created several efficiencies over time. And then ultimately, you're correct, in 2003, there was a disagreement between the controller at the time and state leadership, and those were removed and actually sent over to an entity that we were talking about earlier today, the Legislative Budget Board. So they were taken out of the controller's office and moved over to the Legislative Budget Board, which in fact, the Legislative Budget Board staff continues to work on those. They do those. They may not have the same economic impact as they did many years ago because a lot of low-hanging fruit has been picked and gathered, and now the fruit is higher or either more controversial or it's not as efficient to gain it. I do think those types of continual audits are extremely important because it keeps people honest. It keeps people on their toes. Same as there's a process that I chaired when I was in the legislature called the Legislative Sunset Review. There was a select committee in the House and the Senate that was put together as a joint committee and looked at state agencies every 12 years. Do they need to exist? Yes or no? Do we need to move their programs somewhere else, get rid of their programs? And I think that's important because it's outside the normal budgeting process. And that's extremely important because there are so many pieces of government to where after many years you look over and you go, why do we do that? Well, we do that because we've always done that. Nobody remembers why. And in fact, times have changed and we need to update state government to either get rid of programs that are not needed anymore. And these other processes, I think, are extremely important for those reviews to get rid of those inefficiencies. Because I can promise you, just like in our own personal household, there's inefficiencies. We pay for things that we don't need to have anymore. Government does the same. And these processes are very important to get rid of some of those and save taxpayer dollars and refocus dollars where we need to actually focus our energy.
Well, in concluding today's very useful and informative conversation, I'd like to bring it back to the personal. And that is, I'm looking over your shoulder at pictures of a very handsome and energetic looking Hager family. How has your family, over the 20 years you've been in politics and government, been part of the process? And how does politics impact family life?
It definitely impacts family life. I made the decision 8 years ago when I got elected 8 years ago and a month ago to this job. My wife and I, we had talked, because at the time the state constitution said that I, as an executive office holder, shall reside at the Capitol. And it didn't mean in the Capitol; it meant in Travis County in Austin. And like I mentioned at the beginning, I grew up in this area, Katy-ish area. My wife grew up in the area. Our family was here. Our network was here. Our kids were happy here. They were very young, needless to say. But at that point, we debated, do I move to Austin? Do I not move to Austin? And we decided that I will be in Austin. I travel as a statewide. That's just part of the job. You give a lot of speeches, you travel the state, but also I'm there. But we decided that I would go back and forth. So there's days I make day trips. I go for several days. I come back. And so we decided to kind of remove our kids from that environment of Austin. Austin's a great place, but that's the source of state government, the seat. Everywhere you go, you're in school, you know somebody that's in state government. And here we're really removed from it. So they're just average, normal citizens. They're not tied to it. I think that has kind of helped them. I remind my kids that just because I have a title, people in the lobby, it's their job. Your dad's so smart. He's so wonderful. Mm-hmm. The day after I get elected, guess what? All those contacts and those people that are supposedly my friend in here, they're not going to call me. And so, we're removed from that, is my point. And I think that's been healthy for my children. Also, my role is important, but I don't get the center of the limelight. I'm not the president of the United States. I'm not a U.S. senator. I'm not the governor of the state of Texas, the lieutenant governor. Those get a lot more attention. And that also means in social media, the kind of the hate, there is a lot of it. It's emotional. It's attacking. I get a little bit of it, but I don't get the level that they get. And so my kids have gotten a little bit of a sabbatical in a way from that negativity. It does exist. There was a recent event at school with one of my daughters, and a kid said something he shouldn't have said. He was just a young kid, and he didn't really think the context, and so therefore those happen. But we've been able to work through those. It has been very rewarding. This year, actually, my oldest daughter, who's 17, she's not able to vote, but a lot of her friends are. It's been really interesting where she'll go, wait, or she'd tell me that a friend says, wait, is your dad Glenn Hegar? Are y'all related? And so, that's really, as kids are starting to vote, there's coming about, or teachers will tell them, say, hey, just let you know, I voted for your dad today. And so it's been very rewarding for them to kind of grow up around this, I think, and try to understand the importance of serving and giving back to the community and public policy and the decisions that we make and how they can impact people's lives. My kids they know more about taxes and state policy than probably most kids ever would. They could give the lesson in history class and civics class sometimes, and their teachers even ask them to. So it has been rewarding, but also, I guess, one of the things that I worry about is these things and the negativity. And that worries me going forward with the number of people who are willing to serve and put their family in that light of just kind of social media hate that's out there. And that worries me a lot. And so, I think it's important. I made a comment in one event where my opponent, they were in the back filming me. I got asked a question, and I just wanted to make the point that, my kids, they read this stuff. They read about what someone's saying about their dad. And if it's true, I have no issue with it. But when you just do it to be mean-spirited, they're just a kid and they don't understand the difference. I'm thick-skinned. My wife's thick-skinned. We're used to it. We're adults. We can handle it. I don't worry about all that stuff. But little kids read it. And I'm not asking to shelter my kids, but I just think sometimes people need to think about what they post and what they say. If you're not willing to say it to somebody's face, you might not want to say it at all through social media. And I do worry about the discourse of politics in the future and where we're going, and the willingness to have good people not only willing to sign up to serve, but serve over the duration. That's the part that concerns me more than anything else.
Well, it's clear to see from this hour's very fascinating conversation that the same balance that you have brought to your family also applies to state government and your 20 years of service in it. So thank you for that. Thank you for this hour. And we're grateful to our State Comptroller, Glenn Hegar, for his giving us this time on the Hobby Hour. And we ask that you consider tuning in again for other insights into the way things work. This is Chase Untermeyer thanking you and wishing you all a very happy holiday season.